Hi, my name's Michael. Welcome to Abresham TV. It's good to be back personally. COVID has obviously got in the way, as it's got in the way of a lot of people's lives. But things seem to be on the mend, so we can get going again. Now, I would normally be reading an international news sector, but the news at the moment, I'm sure you'd agree, is really about Afghanistan and what's going there. So I have with me a very good friend, Darius Nasimi. He's from the Afghanistan and Central Asian Association. Welcome, Darius.
Thank you.
And we're going to be looking at some of the really concerning issues. The upheaval, chaos, displacement, and let's just say anger and hatred that's going on in Afghanistan at the moment. Not from all sides, but certainly from one, that's the Taliban, and try to come to terms with it a little bit, and hopefully allow you out there to try and come to terms with it. But you need to know that our hearts are very much with you. So let's try and look at it from our minds and see if we can make some sense. So, Darius, the Taliban are proceeding militarily in an unbelievably rapid manner across Afghanistan, within the north, where they previously, going back to the 1990s, hadn't had so much success and had been held back by the Northern Alliance. They've taken a number of provincial capitals, and writing this yesterday, they'd taken 6, but by this morning it's gone up to 11. Kunduz in the north, and they're shifting their attention, having some support almost in the countryside. Let's not pretend the Taliban don't have those who are backing them slightly. They are moving to the urban areas, to threatening Kandahar, Lashkar. What are we on for here? Is this a civil war? Do you think the Taliban are going to take over what was a republic with democratic principles and introduce their idea of a theocratic state? What's happening? Or will the government forces prevail? What's going to happen? What's your insight? And what are you hearing on the ground in Afghanistan about all this?
Well, what is for certain is that there is a disaster happening in Afghanistan,
right?
Both on a humanitarian level, but also on a political and security level. You know, hundreds of thousands of people have become displaced as a result of the conflict. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, we have over 400,000 internally displaced refugees moving from the provinces to Kabul.
Right.
And I think the people of Afghanistan, they've suffered war for a very long time, since the 1979 invasion by the Soviet Union, which and after the war, after they left Afghanistan, there was an internal civil war between the Mujahideen factions, and then we had the Taliban in the 1990s, and since 2001 we've had, some positive achievements. We have had some peace. In different areas, people could travel day and night in different parts of the country. Women's rights have improved. Human rights in general has improved. But I think since the pullout of the NATO troops recently, the US troops, and I think the US administration made it clear that by the 11th of September they would be pulling out all of their troops from Afghanistan. We can see the impact already on the ground. People are very worried, people are very anxious, and people have a very strong feeling that the situation could get worse, that the women's rights has already been affected in a negative way. I mean, and whether the Taliban will return to their same policies which they imposed on the people. So I think it's both a humanitarian disaster and a strong feeling of uncertainty which surrounds the situation, and people are just worried about what will happen in the future.
So humanitarian disaster, but with an additional sort of social policy, which means that women's rights, the education of women in particular, within this framework, are going to undergo a major reduction in, if you like, their ability to empower themselves. That seems to be a fairly significant part of the Taliban, if you like, their attitudes. They're quite conservative, aren't they? Yeah. If not ultra conservative. Yeah. Just picking up on something you said, so just look at that. The fact that, let's say, back to the British, we talked about this before, I think, and that's a long, long time ago. There always seems to have been somebody in Afghanistan getting involved. It was the British, the Russians, and then within the last 20 years, because they were afraid of terrorist encampment. In fact, they had a fairly major terrorist, as far as they were concerned, Osama bin Laden, encamped in the caves. They wanted to root him out, the American involvement. So that seems to be a feature of Afghanistan, that there's often a like controlling power or somebody who's like... Now, why is that? What do you think? What geopolitically, why do they want to involve themselves in Afghanistan? And let's face it, they normally fail, don't they? They fail. I mean, the British failed, the Russians were out, and now the Americans can't cope anymore. And they pulled the rug because they've taken a lot of military losses, personnel, and the British too, which is very, very sad. And sad for personnel who served in Afghanistan to see now what's happening. So why is there always this international involvement in Afghanistan? What do you think that's about? Why is it geopolitically such an important area?
I think the location of Afghanistan as a country in the heart of Asia and surrounded by countries who have their own interests in the region has made the country very volatile.
Right.
And when you talk about international involvement, I don't think there's always been international involvement in that region. I think in the last 20 years we've had a very positive support from the international community. Right. And the contribution that they've made to Afghanistan, I'm very grateful for. And I appreciate the support of the international community, and I hope that the commitment of the UK will remain in Afghanistan, both in terms of supporting the government in Afghanistan, the people, the civil society. The women have seen a number of achievements, but now when you look at the political situation and the Taliban making rapid advances, expanding from one province to the other province, and the war has moved to the north of Afghanistan, which was a predominantly safe and secure area, and they're just taking over different provinces. And I think Afghanistan's neighbours are also playing a role in supporting different proxies, but I think the response of the government of Afghanistan and the people isn't the same as during the 90s or 80s. I don't think they're unified. I think Afghanistan has become more fragmented, and different tribes are supporting their tribal leaders. There isn't a clear leadership to fight against the Taliban. And I think those same tribal issues that Afghanistan was facing 20, 30 years ago, when there were factions between the Mujahideen, I don't think there's that clear system of leadership, which is why the Afghan army, they're surrendering, and I don't think they have the equipment or the capacity to continue their battles with the Taliban, which is why I think the departure of NATO from Afghanistan was a untimely thing to do.
So going back to the 1990s, you had confrontation between the Taliban. It was civil war. How likely is it that we might see a resurgence in morale? Yeah. If the people are resisting, if they're waving, their flag waving, they're also countering that fundamental aspect of how the Taliban see themselves. Because the Taliban are a bit of a confidence trick, aren't they? Don't they kind of say, oh, we're the Mujahideen, we're here to stop any kind of influence from outside in Afghanistan. Before it was the Russians, but now we're here to defend the country. I think that's a slight confidence trick they use, isn't it? That they assume this identity of being the Mujahideen. So I've heard that on the ground, the people are resisting through shouting, God is great. And that irritates the Taliban, because they like to see themselves as the ones who are, if you like, have the religious mandate, that are the rightful kind of God-given power. So, in that confrontation, have government forces with this backing and potentially the influence of, I call them warlords and militia, have they got a chance, do you think, of defeating the Taliban or not?
I think there are three potential scenarios for what can happen in Afghanistan.
Okay.
I think the first scenario would be that the government would take over the major cities, and the Taliban would go back to the rural areas. That's one scenario, but it's looking very unlikely, because when you look at the recent news about the advances of the Taliban and how today I think they captured the 10th provincial capital.
Push of keeps rolling.
5 or 6 weeks. And if they're making so many rapid advances, that is of course affecting the morale of the people. And although there are some militias who are fighting against the Taliban, I think they have very limited capacity, both in terms of resources and in terms of weapons to fight the Taliban. But so, which leads me to the second scenario, which is a full takeover by the Taliban. But then, which is looking very likely, because if traditionally their main stronghold was in the south of Afghanistan, not in the north, but you can see now that even the north of Afghanistan is being surrendered.
Cut off.
Yeah, surrendered to the Taliban. And you mentioned Kandahar and Lashkar. So I think it will be much easier for them to capture the south, which is where they've traditionally been supported by the local people, and where they're quite popular in some areas as well, in some parts of the south and east of Afghanistan. Even in areas where they have been very unpopular historically, they've made so many advances in the north. I think the morale of the people is very low, and a full takeover by the Taliban is looking very likely. But then the question is, even if the Taliban do take over the country completely, how long will that last? What will be the international reaction to the takeover of the Taliban? And is that going to lead to a situation where the people won't accept the control of the Taliban? And therefore, would that lead to a civil war?
So you seem to be saying, and there's a lot of ideologies in play here, aren't there? Because you seem to be saying the Americans, in a way, with their ideas for liberal democracy and freedom, in a sense, a bit naive back in the days of George Bush Jr. When he came to try that idea out in Iraq, it didn't work too well. But you seem to be saying that those ideas of liberal democracy, of rights for women, for absolutely, have stuck a bit, that they have had an impact. And
yeah, of course.
So how on the ground, how are they feeling about the Americans pulling the rug militarily? I mean, for whatever reason, because Joe Biden's had lots of pressure from his public at home saying, "I know we're enough out there. It's costing too much money, or it's not our problem anymore." How are they feeling on the ground about that? They're obviously feeling pretty, if you like, the military seem to be feeling pretty psychologically vulnerable because the Americans aren't there anymore. What impact has that had, that American withdrawal? Seems quite immense, really.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you talked about the liberal values of democracy. I think in the last 20 years, the people have had the chance to experience some freedom, and they've had a number of successful elections happening. The foundations of democracy and governance has been laid. Women's rights have improved, human rights have improved since 2001. And I think the last 20 years we've seen a new generation of young people, working in the media, active in civil society, working
And young people are both gender.
Yeah, of both genders, exactly, working in different sectors. And that's why the people now feel very, isolated from the world. The departure of NATO means that they're now on their own and they have to fight for themselves. And they're left in a very, destitute position where they don't have access to the
Powerless.
Powerless. Yeah, they don't have access to the support that was available for them in the last 20 years. So when we speak with the people inside the country, they're just completely frightened about what's going to happen.
Okay.
Are we going to return back to the years before 2001? Is the international community still on our side? Are they still paying attention to us, or is everything going to change just significantly? So the people are very concerned about the future.
Okay, I've got a couple of quick-fire questions I'd just like to finish off with, if that's okay, Darius. So, how likely are the Taliban to listen to US peace envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, sorry about my pronunciation, statement that a Taliban government would go internationally unrecognised? Is that like to hurt them or not?
I think that will have some diplomatic pressure against the Taliban, but I don't think that the Taliban will be frightened.
You don't think they care?
Because even before 2001, the whole world was they had no communication with the Taliban in Afghanistan, but they were still continuing, and that's why some people are calling for sanctions. Some people, are blaming neighbouring countries to stop why they supporting the Taliban.
And what do you think is the most repressive part of the Taliban's ideology and outlook socially when they come take over regions? And what do you feel is they're terrorists, aren't they? And they're terrorizing people. But what's the nastiest bit? What's the most repressive aspect of Taliban?
I think their treatment of women is probably one of the most repressive characteristics of the Taliban. I mean, people are now stuck at home in the places where the Taliban has taken over. They don't have the confidence to even go out. And I think the situation of women's rights will significantly deteriorate. But at the same time, I think their really conservative, ethnic ideology can also frighten the different ethnic groups in Afghanistan.
So they might be reinforcing tribal identities. They might not be changing Afghan society for positive, integrative.
I think that will lead to further divisions, further tension between the different ethnic groups. We're basing all of this on what we've seen in the past. The treatment of women was very, very bad. And also the treatment of different ethnic groups. So I think people are very scared whether the Taliban are going to continue to do the same things that they did before.
Darius, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't talk too much. I often do. I do have my opinions. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope you've taken something away from our talk, and it's given you a little food for thought. Our hearts are out in Afghanistan. We don't know if we're going to get a great outcome or even a good outcome. There will be an outcome, and we'll be catching up with what's going on with that next week. Thank you very much.